Well, when you're approaching the second half of your 70th or your 7th decade, I suppose I would say it means that the whole of my life since I first became a Passionist, which was in my mid-teens, has been orientated and shaped by my decision to become a Passionist. It means my whole life, inadequate as it might be on many levels and the number of times one fails, has nonetheless tried to be orientated. It's been the compass point that has kept my life going through all the things that have happened to me over those nearly 60 years that I've been a Passionist. I came into the congregation, into the Passionist province that I belonged to, almost by accident. I was at school and I'd always wanted to be a priest. I've got an uncle who's a priest in the Liverpool diocese, from which I'm part of, and the expectation that I had was that I would follow him and become what's known as a secular priest, a diocesan priest. And then we had a mission, which is an occasion when a couple of priests come into our parish and preach, and they were Passionists. And one of them in particular was a very charismatic sort of person, and I got to know him a little bit during the 2 weeks that he was present, and corresponded with him afterwards and began to learn about this other congregation, this other way of being a priest, which I'd never heard of. And increasingly I felt it was something that appealed to me. There was a monastic side to it. It seemed very radical, a bit frightening in some ways, because when you first join, you have to get up at 2 o'clock in the morning. Not now, but when I joined in my mid-teens, 2 o'clock in the morning for prayers with the rest of the community, back to bed at 3, up again at 6, and you followed a monastic way of living. And there was something in that appealed to me, that it was radical, it was taking seriously this choice to try to give your life to God. And the spirituality of the Passionist congregation from the beginning, learning about St. Paul of the Cross, who founded us, whose whole spirituality was spent in trying to understand this mystery of the idea that a God has become one of us and then ends up dying. This is such a, in one sense, bizarre, outlandish idea that for me it seemed to be that any congregation or any group of people that wanted to take that seriously and to try to understand what that mystery meant was really worth following. So I came into it sort of step by step. I joined when I was only 16, which many people would say was a ridiculous time to join, and went through the period of a novitiate, and then 2 years of philosophy, 4 years of theology. And I can remember thinking during that time when I was a student, why am I doing this? Am I joining because I want to do this? Or is it because of the influences of my family, my schooling, my upbringing? I came from a very Catholic family, and I knew that my parents were very happy about my joining the congregation. So I went through this whole period of doubt where saying, well, am I joining because I want it or because I've been influenced into it? And I came to the conclusion that I was very much there because I'd been influenced into it, that this was the whole culture I was coming from. So that then left me in my early 20s with a dilemma of saying, well, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to say, well, in that case, you'd better step outside, go back and begin again? Or are you going to make it your own? Are you going to make this? And I'm sure that if a psychiatrist got hold of that sort of introspection, they'd probably say, oh, well, you're still fooling yourself. But I felt at that point that I'd made a decision that, yes, it might have been influenced by all this family background, but very much I wanted it to be my decision. And from that moment on, I felt that it was my decision, still influenced, obviously, by the culture from which I came. And I was very fortunate in terms of the way my education went. We at that time, I was one of the last who was educated up to becoming a priest within our own communities. Subsequently, our men would go to a university, to Heathrop and various places like that. So we were educated within the monastery by our own men, I was very fortunate in the men who educated me, particularly in Father Austin Smith, who was my philosophy teacher. And I was ordained in Sutton, St. Helens, which is a parish that's very special to us because that's where Blessed Dominic is buried, not far from my hometown. I was then very fortunate in being asked to go to Rome in the 1960s to study theology. And this was at the time when the Vatican Council was ending, which was a very important event in the Catholic Church, and I was there at the end of it. And after 2 years in Rome, which was wonderful, I was then asked to go to Paris and studied for another 2 years. So I had 2 wonderful years in Rome, 2 even more wonderful years in Paris. And then I was doing some research work living in London. So I'd had a wonderful education that had been, in one sense, begun in a very sort of constrained way, but then had widened out. But the most important decision and the most important event in my education came in 1971, because at that point, my ex-philosophy teacher, Father Austin, asked me would I come with him to go and live in Toxteth in Liverpool. And I then stepped out of the monastic, out of the religious setting, and we ended up in a very small flat in the middle of Toxteth in Liverpool. And there was all sorts of reasons why that happened. And but it was the beginning of a re-education for me, because I was having to then rethink again the values that made me a Passionist. But from the point of view, we no longer had a church setting. We no longer had, people knew that we were priests, but we didn't have any of the cultural surroundings that went with that, which meant that there had to be a re-internalization of what it meant, this whole thing. And I began to learn from the black community in Liverpool, which is one of the oldest communities, the oldest black community in the UK, a whole new way of looking at things. And in a sense, that has been the ongoing situation for me that still invigorates me. This week, for instance, I was at a funeral of one of my friends, and I was just part of the community there. But afterwards, people were introducing me to people that they didn't know me. And they said, "Oh, this is our community priest." Now, I'm not going around as their community priest, but nonetheless, the memory of myself and Father Austin there still sort of continues on. On Austin's gravestone, we've written simply, Passionist, priest, and poet. And those 3 words, in a sense, sum up the genius that Austin was, because he had this remarkable ability of being able to, on the one hand, paint a picture from a wide panoramic angle, and yet at the same time see the flowers that are in the wayside as we walk along a country path. So, and he'd go to the heart of a problem in a way that very few others could, certainly I couldn't, and then be able to express it in a way that encouraged and enlivened others. And his key point was that he was very, very devoted as a Passionist, but he began to ask the questions whether the cultural baggage that we sometimes carry as Passionists, as priests, as all of us, does that cultural baggage sometimes risk getting in the way of our contact with those who we want to actually be in harmony with? And he felt in particular that to use the term, the poor or the crucified of today, the people who are at the edge, are not necessarily not finding God because they don't believe in God, but because the cultural situations, the language we use, the symbols that we have no longer articulate, no longer translate where their reality is. And he saw that as a problem for us as the professionals rather than for the people themselves. So at the heart of his thinking and his whole pastoral outlook was that a need for us to step out of, or to try to step out of, the cultural context in which we'd been, which we were very fortunate with, which we were very comfortable with, which had given us, as for instance in myself, given me a wonderful education of which I was very grateful, but nonetheless, did it risk alienating me from, or alienating us from the people we were working with? And it was for that reason that he asked. It was at a time when the Vatican Council was encouraging us to all religious, to look at new ways of actually reading the signs of the times. And Austin's genius was that he says, well, the best way of reading the signs of the times is not from your own place of security, but to actually step out into the place where the signs of the times are happening. And the black community welcomed us into Liverpool, and I lived with Austin for 40 years. He's the Passionist that I've lived with most of my life until sadly he died. And that 40 years has been totally fundamental for me in terms of rethinking what my life is about, what it is to be a Passionist, what it is. And this is part of, I feel that the Passionist congregation, in a way, I'm very proud to be part of this province, this little group of Passionists, because I think we, to use a cliche, we punch above our weight. We're ready to take a radical step. And particularly at a time when the whole world is at a point of like what's coming together and what's going apart, and that includes the church, we would feel that the base to start with is where those who are at the edges give us, we should be evangelized by, we should be helped by those who have very little, rather than thinking that we've got the answer and we bring to them. So we need to exist with them in order to learn from them and to actually be enthused and reinvigorated by that. And Austin, in a sense, that was his whole philosophy.